Look closely at a human face, not just at one face, but at many. Faces on the train, faces scrolling past you on a screen, faces from different continents, different climates, different histories. You'll notice endless variation. Skin tones shifting from light to dark, hair that curls, coils, or falls straight, noses broad or narrow, cheekbones high or soft. And then there are the eyes. Some appear wide and exposed, others seem narrower, more shielded. And at some point in life, almost everyone wonders the same quiet question, even if they never say it out loud. Why do human eyes look so different across the world? Tonight, we're going to slow that question down, strip it of assumptions, remove modern stereotypes, and trace it back to something far older, far deeper, and far more fascinating than most people ever realize. Because the truth is, when people say Asians have small eyes, they're not describing the eye at all. They're describing a visual illusion created by anatomy, shaped by survival. Let's start with something simple but surprising. The human eyeball itself is almost identical across all populations on Earth. Same size, same structure, same biological limits. An East Asian person does not have smaller eyeballs than a European or African person. The difference you see is not in the eye, it's in everything around it: the eyelids, the surrounding fat, the bone structure of the face, and one specific feature that has quietly carried a story for tens of thousands of years: the epicanthic fold. The epicanthic fold is a small fold of skin that covers part of the inner corner of the eye. It changes how wide the eye opening appears. It softens angles. It alters how light hits the surface of the eye. And while it's most commonly associated today with East and Central Asian populations, it is not unique to them. You find it in Arctic populations, in many indigenous peoples of the Americas, in some African groups, even occasionally in Europeans. In fact, every human baby is born with epicanthic folds. In many populations, the fold recedes as the face develops. In others, it remains into adulthood, which tells us something critical right away. This feature isn't foreign to humanity. It's part of our shared developmental blueprint. So why did it persist in some populations and not others? To answer that, we have to leave the modern world behind and step into a time when survival was written directly onto the human body. Around 20,000 years ago, the Earth looked nothing like it does today. This was the height of the last ice age. Massive glaciers covered huge portions of the northern hemisphere. Sea levels were lower, winds were stronger, winters were longer and deadlier. Entire regions were locked in ice and snow for most of the year. Humans, by this point, had already spread far beyond Africa. Small groups had migrated across the Middle East, into Europe, and deep into Asia, and the people who pushed into Northern and Eastern Asia were walking into some of the harshest environments our species had ever faced. Imagine living in a world where the air itself hurts your face, where snow reflects sunlight so intensely it can burn your eyes, where wind drives ice crystals into your skin like sand, where moisture evaporates instantly, leaving eyes dry, cracked, and vulnerable to infection. In that world, seeing clearly wasn't just convenient, it was everything. Hunting depended on vision, navigation depended on vision, survival depended on vision, and over generations, small anatomical differences began to matter. Individuals with slightly more fat around the eyes were better insulated against the cold. Those with narrower eye openings suffered less from snow glare. Those whose eyelids retained moisture more effectively avoided chronic eye damage. None of this happened overnight. Evolution never works that way. But across thousands of generations, traits that provided even tiny advantages accumulated. Faces changed slowly, subtly, almost invisibly from one generation to the next. The epicanthic fold, in this context, wasn't about appearance, it was about protection. It reduced exposure to freezing wind. It softened the angle of incoming light. It helped preserve moisture in extreme dryness. In modern terms, it functioned a bit like built-in snow goggles. And when you look at where this feature became most common, the pattern is striking. Cold regions, high latitudes, high altitudes, places where the environment punished exposed eyes. But nature rarely works through a single force. As humans adapted biologically, culture adapted too. Once certain facial features became common within a group, they became familiar. Familiarity shaped preference. Preference shaped attraction. Over time, traits that began as survival tools became markers of identity. This is where sexual selection enters the story. People tend to choose partners who resemble their community, their family, their shared history. Over thousands of years, this reinforces existing traits, not because they are necessary anymore, but because they feel right, because they signal belonging. Ancient art from East Asia reflects this. Faces carved in stone or painted on cave walls often emphasize soft contours, broad cheekbones, and narrow, elegant eyes. These weren't arbitrary artistic choices, they mirrored the faces people saw every day, the faces of those who survived, the faces of those who carried their lineage forward. And there's another force at work here too: chance. As humans migrated, they didn't move in massive armies. They moved in small groups, sometimes just a few dozen people. When a small group settles a new region, whatever traits they carry become amplified simply because there's no alternative. This is known as the founder effect. A population doesn't look the way it does because it was designed that way. Often it looks that way because those were the people who arrived first and survived. So by the time the Ice Age began to loosen its grip, East and Central Asian populations already carried a combination of adaptations shaped by cold, altitude, light, isolation, and chance. And those adaptations didn't disappear when agriculture, cities, and empires emerged. They stayed, embedded in faces, passed quietly from parent to child. What you're seeing today is not a modern difference, it's an ancient one, a reminder that the human face is a map, a record of environments endured, a timeline written in skin and bone. And here's something important to hold on to as you let this sink in. None of these differences divide us, they connect us, because every human face, no matter how different it looks, traces back to the same small group of ancestors who once stood in Africa, looked out at an unknown world, and decided to walk forward. If this story is already changing how you see human faces, pause for a moment and think about where you're listening from. What part of the world shaped your features? What climates did your ancestors survive? What silent adaptations are written into your own face? Because this is only the beginning. We've talked about anatomy, we've touched on ice and wind, but we haven't yet explored how extreme altitude, ultraviolet radiation, and thin air push these adaptations even further, or how genetics later confirmed what the landscape had already carved into the human form. And once you understand that, the story of human diversity starts to look very different than what we're usually told. High places, harsh skies, the hidden force behind eye shape. Let's shift our focus upward, not just in time, but in altitude, because the story of the human eye isn't only written in the snow, it's also carved into the cliffs and skies of the world's highest places. After crossing frozen tundras, small bands of humans began to climb, not because they wanted to scale mountains, but because survival required movement. Movement toward shelter, toward game, toward rivers that flowed even when the world was locked in frost. They didn't know they were ascending into the most dangerous place the human body could inhabit. High altitude environments are quietly brutal. They don't announce their dangers like a snowstorm or a wild animal. They erode the body slowly, invisibly. Air becomes thinner. Oxygen levels drop, the heart works harder, the lungs burn, the brain swells, and above all, the sun grows stronger. At high altitudes, ultraviolet radiation doesn't just increase, it multiplies. There's less atmosphere to filter it, snow and ice reflect it from below, and the eyes, delicate, soft, exposed, are on the front lines of that invisible war. In places like the Tibetan Plateau, the Altai Mountains, the Mongolian steppe, and parts of Siberia, early humans lived under these pressures for thousands of years. And just like in the Arctic tundras, their bodies responded in quiet, generational increments. More fat around the eyes, narrower palpebral fissures, the term scientists use for the opening between the eyelids. Epicanthic folds thicken slightly, offering another layer of defense against both wind and light. These changes weren't conscious. No one decided to have them, but those who had even slight protection passed it on. And over time, slight became common, common became standard. But here's where the story gets even more fascinating, because altitude doesn't just shape the face, it changes the blood, the lungs, even the placenta. Tibetan populations, for example, carry a gene called EPIS1. It helps them process oxygen efficiently in low oxygen environments. It's been described as one of the strongest examples of natural selection in modern humans, and it's a gene they may have inherited not from modern Homo sapiens, but from Denisovans, an ancient human species now extinct. That's right. This isn't just a story of cold or sun. It's a story of deep ancestry, of human species interbreeding, of DNA passed silently across millennia. And that DNA shaped everything from how we breathe, to how we see, to how our faces grew. You see, the human face is like a theater stage, shaped by the environment, but also by the actors of history, genes, migrations, random events. Sometimes a mutation occurs, a gene switches off, a new feature emerges, and if that feature helps, it stays. If it hurts, it fades. If it does neither, it might still persist, carried quietly in the background of the genome. The structure of the eye, the fat surrounding it, the angle of the cheekbones, the depth of the orbit, all these things were shaped by this interplay between biology and geography. And when you stack high altitude on top of freezing temperatures, plus wind, UV radiation, and snow glare, you get one of the most intense natural selection laboratories on Earth. In this lab, the epicanthic fold wasn't an exotic feature, it was an answer. Now step back for a moment. Look at a modern face, maybe yours, maybe someone else's. What you're seeing is the fossil of decisions made by nature, a face shaped not by choice or design, but by the patient, relentless pressure of survival. And yet, even with all these environmental pressures, not every person from high altitude or cold environments developed these traits. That's because evolution doesn't operate like a paintbrush. It works more like a sculptor with broken tools. Sometimes it shapes perfectly. Sometimes it leaves rough edges. Sometimes it lets things stay that no longer serve a purpose. There's also another player in this game, genetic drift, random chance. If a small group of people carries a certain trait, even if that trait has no advantage, it can become common simply because it was there at the start. And if that group remains isolated long enough, that random trait becomes a signature. Now mix all of this together: cold weather adaptations, high altitude survival, UV protection, random genetic drift, and isolation over time, and you get populations with distinct facial features. Features that didn't evolve to be different, they evolved to survive. But the human mind is a pattern seeking machine, and when it sees difference, it craves explanation. That's why people in the 1800s, looking at these facial features, invented wild pseudoscientific theories. They claimed superiority, inferiority, intelligence levels, civilizational worth, all based on how much skin covered the corner of an eye. It was wrong then, it's wrong now, because when you understand the true reasons behind eye shape variation, You stop asking, why are they different? And start asking something more powerful. What kind of world did your face come from? That's the question that changes everything. And it's the question we're going to keep answering. Because next, we're going to explore something unexpected: why populations with similar climates and environments sometimes evolved very different facial features. Why the Inuit of North America don't always share the same traits as East Asians, despite living in the same brutal cold. Why some tropical populations have epicanthic folds while others don't. And once we open that door, we'll have to go even deeper into genetics, migration bottlenecks, and the randomness written into every face you've ever seen. It's time to stop thinking in borders and races. It's time to start thinking in history and pressure, and the next chapter will take us there. A Tale of Two Winters: Why Similar Climates Don't Always Shape Similar Faces. We tend to assume that similar environments produce similar adaptations: cold, snowy conditions. You'd expect people in those places to look alike. That's what makes this part of the story so puzzling and so revealing. If the cold sculpted the epicanthic fold into East Asian populations, why don't we see the same features in every cold adapted group? Why, for example, don't all Arctic populations, like the Inuit of North America, share the exact same eye features? Let's explore this mystery. The Inuit are often held up as an example of adaptation to extreme cold. They live in one of the harshest climates on Earth: northern Canada, Greenland, Alaska, long winters, freezing temperatures, constant snow. So, why don't all Inuit people have the same prominent epicanthic folds, often associated with East Asians? The answer lies in two quiet forces that shape evolution just as much as environment: time and population size. You see, the ancestors of modern Inuit people only arrived in the Arctic about 1,000 years ago. Their migration was relatively recent compared to the East Asian populations who adapted over tens of thousands of years. Evolution needs time to work, not centuries, millennia. This isn't just a theory, it's supported by archaeology and genetics. The Inuit descended from the Thule people, who moved from Alaska eastward across the Arctic around the 11th century. Before that, there were earlier waves of migration into the region, but the genetic legacy of those groups is limited in today's populations. Compare that to East Asian populations, whose ancestors have inhabited northern Asia since the Ice Age, a period of more than 20,000 years. That's 20 times as much time for subtle anatomical shifts to accumulate and become stable. But time isn't the only factor. Population size and genetic mixing matter too. When a small group of people moves into a new region, the range of genetic variation they carry is limited. Whatever traits they start with become more prominent, not always because they're advantageous, but because there are no other options. This is called the founder effect. It's like starting a new town with only 5 paint colors. Every house will reflect those colors, no matter what kind of weather rolls in. Now imagine if that small population stays isolated. No outsiders, no mixing, no new genetic material. The traits they carry become locked in, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes muted. In contrast, populations that remain connected to wider genetic networks through migration, trade, or war retain more diversity. More variation means more options. More options means slower fixation of specific traits. That's part of why we see such diversity even among groups who live in similar climates. And there's another piece of the puzzle: environmental variation within regions. Not all cold is created equal. The Arctic is cold but dry. High altitude regions in Asia are cold but also windy, UV intense, and oxygen poor. Siberia is cold but vast and variable. These micro differences matter. Think of it like this: wearing a jacket helps in cold weather, but if the wind is fierce, you'll want a windbreaker. If the sun is blinding, you'll want goggles. If the air is dry, you'll want eye drops. The same is true for evolutionary pressure. Each environment pushes in a slightly different direction. So the Inuit adapted in ways specific to their Arctic context. Their bodies became short and broad to conserve heat. Their facial blood vessels constricted efficiently. Their diets shifted toward high fat, marine based nutrition, influencing metabolism. But they didn't necessarily need the same eye adaptations as their Siberian or Tibetan counterparts, because the challenges were different. This is what makes evolution so beautiful and so frustrating to simplify. There is no one size fits all formula, no guaranteed outcome, no neat, tidy chart of cause and effect. Evolution is improvisation, a dance between DNA and dirt, between ancestors and air, between geography and time. That's why two groups of humans can live in freezing temperatures for centuries and look completely different. It's not contradiction, it's complexity. And the more you embrace that complexity, the more human faces start to make sense. Now let's flip the question. If cold didn't always produce narrow eyes and epicanthic folds, why do we sometimes see those features in places that aren't cold at all? You'll find these traits to varying degrees in some Southeast Asian populations, some indigenous groups in South America, and even some African tribes. What's going on there? To answer that, we have to look beyond the thermometer. We have to examine migration patterns, genetic drift, random mutation, and most surprisingly, shared ancestry, because some of these populations share ancient DNA links with Northern Asian ancestors. Others developed similar features independently, a phenomenon known as convergent evolution. It's like wings in bats and birds. Same function, different history. Evolution sometimes solves similar problems in similar ways, even if the problems arise in different places. So maybe narrow eye openings help reduce light exposure in equatorial regions with intense sun. Maybe fat around the eyes protects against dry winds in savannas, as well as in snowy steppes. Maybe the same features evolved multiple times under different conditions. And maybe, just maybe, we need to stop asking why people look different and start asking how many ways humans found to survive. This question will guide us forward, because in the next part we'll go even deeper into the mysteries of genetic drift, bottlenecks, and population isolation. We'll uncover how some of the most visible traits in humanity came from accidents of history, not grand evolutionary plans. And we'll start to see just how much of what we call race is really just a story of migration, isolation, and time. The next piece of the puzzle is coming into focus: the dice of evolution, drift, bottlenecks, and the power of isolation. Every face you've ever seen, yours, mine, the billions drifting through screens and streets, is a snapshot of randomness. Yes, adaptation plays a role. Yes, the environment sculpts us. But sometimes what we think is evolution's logic is really just luck, or the lack of it. To understand how certain facial features became common, like the epicanthic fold, we have to move beyond the idea that every trait must serve a purpose, because some features didn't spread because they helped. They spread because they happened to be there when history slammed shut behind a group of people and locked them in. This is the realm of genetic drift, bottlenecks, and isolation, the silent architects of human diversity. Let's start with genetic drift. Imagine a village of 100 people. 10 of them have a rare trait, say slightly more orbital fat. Now imagine that a flood destroys the village and only 20 people survive. Pure chance determines who lives, and by random luck, 5 of the survivors carry that rare trait. Suddenly, something that was present in just 10% of the population now makes up 25%. Not because it was better, but because of fate. That's genetic drift. It's evolution's coin toss. And over generations, these tosses compound. In small populations, drift is powerful. Traits can vanish or dominate by chance alone, and when those small groups stay isolated, geographically, culturally, or reproductively, the randomness gets fossilized. Now apply that idea to ancient humans. Throughout our history, we've passed through genetic bottlenecks, moments where the human population shrank to dangerously low levels. One of the most famous occurred around 70,000 years ago, possibly triggered by a massive volcanic eruption known as the Toba event. It's estimated that the global human population may have dropped to as few as 1,000, 10,000 individuals. Imagine that, all of humanity reduced to the size of a town, every gene pool narrowed, every roll of the dice magnified. Now imagine those survivors splitting off. One group moves into Central Asia, another into the Middle East, another into Europe. Each group carries only a fraction of the genetic diversity of the original population. Each one walks into a different environment. Each one, through chance and necessity, becomes different. This is where facial traits begin to diverge. In East and Central Asia, populations endured long-term isolation due to geography, mountains, deserts, climate barriers. These obstacles prevented large-scale mixing for millennia, which means that whatever traits were present in those early populations, whether useful or not, became the default. One of those traits, the epicanthic fold. Maybe it began as an adaptation, maybe it was neutral, maybe it didn't matter. But in small, isolated groups, traits don't need to be useful, they just need to be present. Then, once they're common enough, something interesting happens. The group begins to see those traits as normal. Anything outside that range becomes different. Over time, culture builds around those norms. Language reflects them. Art immortalizes them. Beauty standards emerge. A neutral feature becomes a marker of identity. And once identity takes hold, the feature spreads even faster, not through biology, but through social preference. This is known as sexual selection. People tend to choose partners who reflect the traits they see as beautiful or familiar. That reinforces certain physical features over generations, even if those features serve no survival purpose. This might explain why the epicanthic fold persisted and even deepened in some populations long after the Ice Age ended. The environmental pressure may have relaxed, but the cultural reinforcement didn't. Now let's return to isolation. Today we live in a hyper-connected world. Airplanes, social media, urban migration, we're mixing more than ever. But for most of human history, groups were incredibly isolated. A mountain range could mean never seeing another tribe. A river could be a border for centuries. And in those small bubbles, facial features settled like sediment, slowly, repetitively, predictably. And then, every once in a while, history would deliver another bottleneck, a war, a famine, a migration forced by drought. Every time, the dice rolled again. Every time, traits shuffled. And every time, a new combination emerged. So when you see a face and wonder why it looks the way it does, understand that you're looking at a story of random survival. Not perfect design, not planned adaptation, but a layered history of events, accidents, and inheritances. Let's bring it back to East Asia. The widespread presence of the epicanthic fold in East Asian populations is likely due to a mixture of factors: initial adaptation to cold and UV, genetic drift and bottlenecks in small early populations, long-term isolation reinforcing existing traits, sexual selection based on emerging beauty norms, cultural transmission across empires and dynasties. No single explanation suffices. It's the combination that tells the real story, and that story matters, because the myth of biological determinism, the idea that certain features equal certain values, has done real harm. Colonialism, racism, eugenics, all fed on the lie that physical traits imply superiority or inferiority. But when you understand the role of drift, bottlenecks, and isolation, You realize how arbitrary these differences are. A fold of skin isn't destiny, it's legacy, not a value statement, but a historical footprint, not a signal of race, but a record of place. And now, the most fascinating twist: sometimes traits that evolve in one group, by chance, pressure, or both, end up appearing in totally unrelated populations. Why? Because nature has limited tools, and when two environments share challenges, evolution may find the same solution twice. This is called convergent evolution. It's why whales and bats both developed echolocation, why cacti in the Americas and euphorbia in Africa look nearly identical. They didn't inherit the trait from the same ancestor, they evolved it separately because it worked. So when you find the epicanthic fold in Native American populations, or among the San people of southern Africa, or in scattered families across Europe, it's not an error, it's another chapter in the same book. And that book is far from over, because in the next part, we're going to follow the migrations that carried these traits across continents. We'll trace the paths of ancient humans from the heart of Asia into the Americas and discover how a cold weather adaptation ended up in tropical rainforests, deserts, and beyond. We're not just talking about eyes anymore, we're talking about how the entire face becomes a passport stamped by time, terrain, and 10,000 generations of movement. The map is unfolding, the trail is getting clearer, and the faces we think we know are about to reveal something entirely new. You thought it was over, that the story had been told, that 10 parts were enough to hold the weight of one question: why some eyes look the way they do. But time doesn't work like that, and neither does history, because just when we think we've reached the end, something buried rises again, something unspoken, something waiting. So here's the truth: this story never ends, because you are still changing, and your face, this map of adaptation, memory, pain, beauty, is not done evolving. What if I told you the face of the future already exists? Not in labs, not in runways, but in the forgotten places, in faces overlooked, in traits deemed minor, exotic, or disappearing. Let's go back and forward to the Ainu people of Japan, with features that don't fit the East Asian stereotype: wavy hair, round eyes, beards. For centuries, they were treated as less Asian, less refined, but genetically they are ancient, bearers of traits from the first migrants into Japan, long before rice and empires, or the San people of southern Africa, with epicanthic folds and high cheekbones, though far from the frozen north, among the oldest continuous genetic lineages on Earth. Their features tell stories older than agriculture, or the Melanesians, whose dark skin and blonde hair puzzle outsiders. Proof that human variation isn't linear, it's layered, recursive, astonishing. These are the faces that time tried to erase, and they may be closer to the face of the future than any of us realize. Because as we mix across cities, nations, platforms, something new is emerging: the global face. It's not a blur, not a beige average. It's a symphony of noses shaped by altitude, eyes carved by sun and snow, lips molded by wind and whisper. This face won't be defined by race, but by reach, by ancestry and agency. A Brazilian, Korean, Nigerian designer in London, a Thai German American student in Toronto, a Moroccan indigenous Malay musician in Sydney. They are not outliers, they are previews of what happens when you shatter borders and build bridges. But here's the twist: even as we blend, we remember. Our features may merge, but our stories deepen, because each trait carries a timeline. Each face is a time capsule. And in this new era of DNA tests and digital filters, we're not just asking, where am I from? We're asking, how do I honor it? Maybe the future isn't one face, but a million mirrors, each one reflecting a different lineage, a different resilience, a different truth. Maybe what we call small eyes or big eyes will someday just be eyes, not signs, not signals, not systems, just expressions of something infinitely more important, the human will to continue. So, no, this is not the end. This is the beginning of a new kind of history, one written not in textbooks or empires, but in your face, your choices, your curiosity. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you look in the mirror, you'll see not just a reflection, but a revolution. Roughly 10,000 years ago, as the last ice age retreated and ancient glaciers gave way to rivers that cut deep into the land, something unimaginable happened. Humans stopped moving. For hundreds of thousands of years, they had wandered, from the savannas of Africa to the highlands of Central Asia. They moved in search of game, shelter, water. They were nomads, resilient, adaptive, ever shifting. But then something changed. Somewhere along the Tigris and Euphrates, someone sowed a seed. In the Yangtze Basin, someone placed a rice shoot in the wet soil. In the Americas, maize began to take root. This was not an accident. This was a revolution. We call it the agricultural revolution. But that term hardly does justice to its consequences. It didn't just change how humans ate, it changed how they lived, how they thought, how they believed. In Mesopotamia, they grew wheat and barley. In Mesoamerica, maize and beans. In China, millet and rice. In the Andes, potatoes. In sub-Saharan Africa, sorghum and yams. Each of these agricultural hearths birthed something radical: stability. No longer needing to follow the herds, humans could now stay in one place. And with that sedentism came surplus. For the first time in history, a person could produce more food than they needed. This surplus could feed others, people who didn't farm, artisans, builders, priests, soldiers. Surplus created social complexity. Hierarchies formed. Someone had to manage the stores of grain, someone else to protect them, someone else to tally them. And then came cities. Not mere camps or villages, but permanent human settlements with thousands of inhabitants, organized labor, defenses, markets. The earliest cities, like Jericho or Catalhuyuk, lacked streets as we know them. Their homes were packed tightly together, entered from rooftops. Life was communal, but over time, cities grew stratified. Social roles became fixed. Rulers emerged, religious elites, warriors, peasants, slaves. And so, from tiny seeds planted in soft soil, kingdoms were born. This transformation was not benign. Alongside cities came something else: conflict. Hunter-gatherer societies could escape danger by moving, but farmers were tethered. Their wealth, fields, granaries, walls was static. To protect it, they needed weapons. To expand it, they needed war. We see the earliest fortresses arise: ditches, palisades, later stone walls. Organized violence became institutional: armies, generals, conquest. But humans didn't just build walls, they built ideas. Some of the earliest monumental architecture was not defensive, but religious. At Göbekli Tepe, in present-day Turkey, humans carved massive T-shaped stones over 11,000 years ago, not to live in, but to worship. Before cities, before agriculture even fully took hold, humans were erecting temples. This reveals something profound. Spirituality preceded civilization. Myth came before monarchy. Before humans organized politically, they gathered ritually. It is around this time that we see the birth of writing, not as poetry, but as math. In Sumer, writing began with ledgers. How many goats? How many jars of oil? How many sacks of grain? Cuneiform, not a language of art, but of control. But over time, those marks began to tell stories, myths, laws, dreams. With writing came memory. No longer were stories passed only by voice. Now they could endure. The past could be preserved. the future imagined. Civilization became cumulative, knowledge built on knowledge, mistakes and victories alike recorded, and what emerges from this cocktail of farming, hierarchy, writing, and war? States, true organized states, with kings, borders, taxes, punishments, with religion woven into governance, with law etched in stone. But this came with a cost. In hunter gatherer societies, inequality was rare, resources were shared. But now power pooled at the top. A priest might own land, a king might own hundreds of lives, and a farmer might be born and die in debt. Yet within this world of oppression, something extraordinary also flourished: art. Humans painted frescoes, carved statues, built ziggurats and pyramids, not just to live in, but to awe. Because for all the violence, humans never stopped wondering, who are we? Why are we here? What lies beyond the horizon? We became something new, not just Homo sapiens, but civilized sapiens, a species now entangled in institutions of its own making. In Part 13, we will journey deeper into the world of the first great empires. We'll walk the roads of Babylon, kneel in Egyptian temples, sail the Indus. We'll see how power was not just wielded, but mythologized, and how early civilizations learned to shape the world in their image. Stay with me. By the time humans had learned to sow grain and etch laws into stone, something else began to rise, something more intangible, but no less powerful: the state ideology. Once cities had formed, agriculture secured, religion institutionalized, and writing etched into permanence, civilizations began developing vast systems of belief that underpinned authority and structure. In the Nile Valley, the ancient Egyptian worldview was sculpted by predictability. The Nile's annual floods brought life, fertility, and stability. This rhythm shaped not just crops, but thought. The pharaoh was not merely a political leader, he was divine, a living god on earth, tasked with preserving Ma'at, the principle of cosmic order and harmony. Everything from temple architecture to the organization of society mirrored a celestial and earthly balance. The pyramids, towering and precise, were not just tombs but metaphysical statements. Life after death was not feared, it was prepared for, codified, and central to daily life. In contrast, Mesopotamia was a region of volatility. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers were lifelines, but erratic and often destructive. This uncertainty seeped into the Mesopotamian psyche. Their gods were powerful yet unpredictable, often angry or indifferent. The mythology reflected this instability. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, even kings could not escape death. Power in Mesopotamia was built on conquest and divine appeasement. Fortified cities like Babylon rose from the earth with walls thick enough to resist not only armies but divine wrath. Religion and rulership were intertwined, but here the gods had to be feared and convinced, not merely honored. Moving east to the Indus Valley, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro tell a different story. Urban planning was sophisticated: grids, drainage systems, standardized bricks. Yet there are no grand palaces, no ostentatious tombs, no visible monarchy. Power may have been more distributed, perhaps even communal. The lack of centralized imagery suggests a social structure built on shared civic norms rather than divine kingship. But the mystery remains, as their script is still undeciphered. In ancient China, during the Shang dynasty, authority rested on ancestral connection. Kings did not rule by personal charisma alone, but by lineage, through ties to the divine past. The oracle bones, inscribed with questions and read through cracks, were early forms of state consultation with the heavens. The past was sacred, and reverence for ancestors became the bedrock of social order. The emperor wasn't just a ruler, he was the intermediary between heaven and earth. Order depended on fulfilling one's role within the family, the state, and the cosmos. Farther still, in early Mesoamerica, The Olmec civilization began carving massive basalt heads, each face unique, lifelike, imposing. These were more than portraits, they embodied power, legacy, and divine human fusion. Rulers were larger than life. Their faces became the symbols of the cosmos, aligned with rituals and celestial cycles. Human sacrifice was not cruelty, it was cosmic necessity, ensuring the sun would rise, the rains would fall, and life would continue. From the Andes to the Aegean, early civilizations began encoding power in architecture, religion, and myth. They weren't just building cities, they were constructing mental frameworks. Power was justified not by law alone, but by story. Monarchs became semi divine, laws were handed down by gods, temples were cosmic diagrams, hierarchies were inscribed in both stone and mind. Empires began to stretch their borders. The Hittites, fierce and well armed, clashed with Egypt at Kadesh. The Assyrians turned warfare into a state industry. Their stone reliefs glorified brutal sieges and mass deportations. Fear was currency, conquest was ideology. In contrast, the Persian Empire under Cyrus and Darius introduced a model of centralized tolerance. Local customs were often respected. Roads and messengers tied the empire together. The idea of a unified but multicultural empire emerged. The king was not just ruler, he was architect of unity. Elsewhere, tiny city-states began experimenting with radically different concepts of governance. In Greece, rugged terrain prevented unification under a single ruler. Instead, city-states like Athens and Sparta developed their own models. In Athens, a new idea began to form that citizens could rule themselves. Not all people, only free male land-owning natives, but it was a spark. Assemblies, debates, voting. The individual, not just the king, became politically relevant. Simultaneously, in the Indian subcontinent, new philosophical systems challenged old hierarchies. Jainism, with its radical nonviolence, Buddhism, with its rejection of caste and craving, these were spiritual revolutions, redefinitions of what power, suffering, and morality meant. The ruler's legitimacy began to hinge not only on conquest or birth, but on righteousness or dharma. The ideal king was not a conqueror, but a just guardian. Ideas traveled through trade, war, and migration. Civilizations influenced each other. Scripts crossed borders. Coins carried faces and slogans. Religious texts were copied and reshaped. Throughout this world, the human face gained new roles, not merely expressive, but symbolic. Kings stamped their visages on currency. Deities were sculpted with idealized features. The face became a mask of ideology, a projection of cosmic legitimacy. Power had evolved beyond brute strength. It was now spiritual, intellectual, aesthetic. It was felt not only on the battlefield, but in ritual, in education, in silence. To understand a civilization, you no longer looked only at its army. You looked at its calendar, its temples, its poetry. And yet, for all their differences, these civilizations were built by the same species, same bones, same brains, same hands, different songs. The next evolution was approaching, the age when identity would no longer rest solely on myth and memory, but on recorded law, codified language, and imperial narrative. As civilization solidified, so too did their instruments of permanence. Language was no longer fluid, it became fixed. Laws were no longer spoken, they were carved. Identity, once a shifting narrative passed through oral memory, became a tool of state. This shift was more than administrative, it was ontological. It redefined what it meant to be human. The earliest legal codes reveal this transformation. In Babylon, the Code of Hammurabi didn't just regulate trade or crime, it inscribed social order into stone. There was a hierarchy, nobles, commoners, slaves, each with different penalties, different rights. Justice became stratified. Law became not just a deterrent, but a declaration of who mattered. In China, the Zhou dynasty refined the concept of the mandate of heaven, a ruler governed not by blood alone, but by virtue. If a king ruled justly, heaven favored him. If not, natural disasters, invasions, and rebellion were interpreted as signs of lost legitimacy. This idea transformed tyranny into treason, not by the ruled, but by the cosmos itself, and it offered a feedback loop between ethics and authority. The Romans, borrowing from both Greece and Etruria, systematized law into something even more enduring, the Republican Code. The 12 tables were displayed in the Forum, accessible to all citizens. Roman law became exportable, applied to provinces, shaped by reason, codified in Latin. It wasn't just a legal system, it was a universal logic that outlived the empire itself. This evolution of law paralleled the rise of imperial myth-making. Alexander the Great spread Greek culture, not just through conquest, but through cities. Alexandria in Egypt, in Syria, in Mesopotamia, each city became a node of Hellenistic fusion. Statues, language, coinage, Greek deities blended with local gods. Zeus with Amun, Athena with Ishtar. This was not erasure, it was assimilation. In India, the Mauryan Empire under Ashoka inverted the script. After brutal conquests, Ashoka embraced Buddhism and carved edicts across the land on pillars, rocks, caves. These inscriptions weren't in palaces, but in public. They declared kindness, tolerance, piety. The empire became a stage not for domination, but for ethical performance. In every great state, we begin to see the emergence of recorded identity, censuses, tax rolls, military conscription, names, births, deaths. A human became not just a villager or a traveler, but a subject, a citizen, a statistic. This was both empowering and dangerous. Empowering because rights could be claimed, dangerous because people could be categorized, controlled, erased. Religion evolved in tandem, no longer tribal or local. Faiths began to speak in universal terms. Zoroastrianism offered a cosmic dualism, light versus darkness. Judaism, a covenantal monotheism. Later, Christianity and Islam would rise, each with a sacred text, a moral law, a global aspiration. These faiths transcended ethnicity. They built imagined communities of believers who would never meet but shared prayers, rituals, texts. Such belief systems created the first transnational identities. A Christian in Antioch and one in Alexandria could feel kinship. A Muslim in Baghdad and another in Cordoba could recognize the same call to prayer. Language, law, and faith began weaving vast networks across geography, but empire always walks with shadow. Beneath the architecture of law and religion, systems of oppression flourished. Slavery became institutional. Women's roles narrowed. Outsiders were demonized. Deviance was punished. Uniformity was enforced, not just in dress or speech, but in thought. Art reflected this. Portraiture idealized power. Mosaic and mural served doctrine. Music and literature extolled rulers, gods, victory. The state became the curator of culture, and in doing so, it shaped the very symbols by which people understood themselves. Yet, under this weight, resistance brewed. Philosophers began to question received truths. In Athens, Socrates challenged the assumptions of virtue and knowledge. In India, Upanishadic thinkers explored the self as an illusion. In China, Confucians and Taoists debated order versus spontaneity. Everywhere, the tension between structure and soul grew. Human identity had become mapped, but not yet liberated. The road ahead would lead through revolutions, spiritual, political, technological, that would shake the very foundations of what it meant to be a person in history. And still, every face carried it all: the law, the belief, the burden, the potential. As identity became codified and belief universalized, empires reached their zenith, roads stretched across continents, scripts standardized, armies professionalized, coinage unified economies. Yet beneath this surface of order, a deeper transformation was unfolding, the gradual shift from collective myths to individual awareness. In the Roman Empire, the idea of civitas, citizenship, gave legal standing to individuals across vast lands. A person in Gaul or Judea could appeal to Roman law, be taxed under Roman codes, serve in Roman legions. This was more than administration. It was a psychological shift to belong to an idea, not just a tribe or city. Rome became more than a place, it became an identity. At the same time, Roman architecture, sculpture, and literature spread ideals of heroism, virtue, reason, and order, but these ideals masked brutality, slavery, spectacle, imperial conquest. Gladiatorial games entertained the masses with choreographed violence. Roman roads brought commerce, but also war. The Pax Romana was peace through dominance. In China, the Han Dynasty consolidated power with Confucian ideals. The emperor was the son of heaven, but he ruled by virtue, at least in theory. Examinations for bureaucrats tested knowledge of classical texts. Education became a path to power. Meritocracy, though limited, was born. This emphasis on learning shaped identity as something cultivated, not merely inherited. Meanwhile, in India, the Gupta Empire flourished with advances in mathematics, astronomy, art, and literature. The concept of zero, the decimal system, and surgical techniques emerged here. Hindu philosophy deepened, exploring consciousness, time, and the nature of the self. Buddhism spread across Asia, from monasteries in India to mountaintop temples in China and Japan. Monks became global travelers. Ideas transcended borders. In Mesoamerica, the Maya tracked celestial bodies with astounding precision. Their calendars marked not just agricultural cycles, but cosmological epochs. Time was sacred. The universe had patterns, ages, destinies. Kings ruled not just by lineage, but by cosmic alignment. Rituals, architecture, and warfare were tied to this temporal worldview. And across the Sahara, in West Africa, powerful trading states like Ghana and later Mali emerged. Gold flowed from the Sahel, salt from the desert, ideas from the north. Islam would later arrive, reshaping law, scholarship, and trade. Timbuktu would become a center of learning, with thousands of manuscripts and libraries, testaments to a literary tradition often ignored by mainstream history. In all these empires, the individual was now embedded in complex networks of law, trade, religion, knowledge. People began to write personal letters, carve their names into monuments, record family lineages. The self was emerging, not fully autonomous, but increasingly distinct within the collective. Yet this self was still bound by birth, by class, by gender. A woman in Athens had no political voice. A slave in Rome could be property for life. A low-caste person in India might be denied entry into temples. Identity was rising, but it was also restricted. The stirrings of rebellion grew louder. Prophets and revolutionaries emerged. Jesus of Nazareth preached a kingdom not of this world. His message threatened Roman and Jewish authorities alike, not with armies, but with inversion. The meek would inherit the earth. Early Christians formed underground communities that challenged Roman hierarchies. In Persia, Mani synthesized religions into a universalist dualism, light versus darkness, spirit versus matter. His followers, the Manichaeans, spread across empires, often persecuted. In China, millenarian movements predicted the fall of dynasties and the rise of a just world. Taoist and Buddhist sects promised liberation from suffering, not through politics, but through inner transformation. Identity was no longer just about status, it became about salvation. As printing technologies slowly emerged, as literacy spread among monks, merchants, and scholars, texts became portable knowledge, portable belief. The written word was no longer just law, it was liberation. Ideas crossed mountains, deserts, oceans. With every copy made, a new mind opened, and within that mind, the past lived on. not just in memory, but in interpretation. This momentum would soon shatter the ancient world. Empires would fall, new faiths would rise. The Middle Ages, the Islamic Golden Age, and the coming scientific revolutions would redefine not just history, but the human mind itself. And always the face remained, a canvas of ancestry and aspiration, a mirror of the cosmos, a cipher of the state. History did not pause as empires fractured. Instead, it multiplied, diversifying, deepening, layering new forms of meaning upon ancient structures. As Rome fell in the west, Byzantium rose in the east, preserving Greek thought and Christian theology. In the sands of Arabia, a voice emerged that would reshape civilization. Muhammad, a merchant from Mecca, spoke words that would become the Quran, a revelation, a revolution, a return. Islam was not just a religion, it was a total reordering of society. Prayer, law, trade, charity, and governance became unified. Arabic became a sacred language. Mosques became centers of learning, not just worship. The Islamic world stretched from Spain to India, integrating Greek science, Persian literature, Indian numerals. Baghdad's House of Wisdom translated the ancient world. Algebra, optics, medicine, astronomy, preserved, perfected, and passed forward. In Europe, the so-called Dark Ages were never truly dark. Monasteries kept the flame of literacy alive. Charlemagne's court tried to unify learning under Christian rule, but feudalism fractured power, lords, vassals, serfs, a society stratified not only by wealth, but by divine right. Kings ruled by grace of God. Peasants labored under cosmic hierarchy. Yet even here, change brewed. The stirrings of universities, the rediscovery of Aristotle through Islamic philosophers like Avicenna and Averroes, scholasticism emerged, faith seeking reason, the tension between revelation and logic. In Africa, the kingdom of Mali reached its zenith. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca astonished the world. Gold-laden caravans, diplomatic spectacle, intellectual ambition. Timbuktu's scholars debated theology and science in libraries rivaling any in Europe. In the Americas, civilizations flourished with parallel brilliance. The Aztecs built Tenochtitlan on a lake, with canals and causeways rivaling Venice. Their empire was structured by tribute, war, and ritual. The sun required nourishment, human hearts. Identity here was shaped not by individual destiny, but by cosmic responsibility. The Inca, farther south, built roads across the Andes. No wheels, no writing as we know it, but a network of runners and knots. Quipu encoded memory and tribute. Their empire was vast, centralized, and sacred. The Sapa Inca was descendant of the sun. Across the Pacific, dynasties rose and fell in China. The Tang dynasty was cosmopolitan, welcoming traders, poets, pilgrims. Cheng'an rivaled any capital in size and sophistication. Art, music, invention thrived. The Song dynasty would later advance printing, gunpowder, and mechanical engineering. But as innovation surged, so did control. Bureaucracy expanded. Exams became more rigid. Knowledge, once liberating, became a gatekeeper. Japan developed its own synthesis. Shinto and Buddhism entwined. The emperor, divine yet distant. Real power lay with the shogun. Samurai codes of honor. Bushido formed a psychological architecture of loyalty, sacrifice, and silence. Identity here was defined by duty, not desire. Global contact intensified. The Silk Roads buzzed with goods and gossip. A Genoese merchant might wear silk dyed in Persia, sipped with sugar from India, and written on paper from China. Knowledge flowed like spice. Ideas didn't respect borders, but nor did disease. In the 14th century, the Black Death swept across Eurasia. It killed indiscriminately. Peasants, nobles, monks. It shattered assumptions. Where was God? Why had the righteous died? In this void, skepticism grew. Art turned macabre. Faith turned inward. Some sought comfort in mysticism, others in reason. This period also saw a subtle transformation, the emergence of interior selfhood. Diaries began to appear. Personal letters took on introspective tone. Confessions were written not only to priests, but to oneself. The face was no longer just a social mask or cosmic vessel. It was a window into the soul. Portraiture shifted. Artists in Italy began capturing not just likeness, but emotion. The Renaissance dawned. In Florence, Leonardo studied anatomy, not to glorify God, but to understand man. Humanism was born, the radical idea that human experience was worthy of study in itself. Printing exploded. Gutenberg's press didn't just multiply Bibles, it multiplied voices. Reformation shattered Catholic unity. Luther translated Scripture so that every soul might read. Identity fractured. The universal church gave way to personal faith. Conscience replaced clerical authority. And still, colonial horizons widened. Portuguese ships rounded Africa. Spanish caravels crossed the Atlantic.
What followed was not mere discovery, it was domination, maps redrawn, peoples enslaved, worlds erased, and yet resistance endured. In every colony, identities adapted, hybrid languages, syncretic religions, maroon societies, memory smuggled through rhythm and ritual. The colonized refused to forget who they had been, even as they became something new. Identity now bore scars, but also seeds.
Across oceans, across time, how ancient eyes crossed into the New World stand at the edge of the Bering Strait today, and it seems impossible, an endless stretch of frigid sea separating Russia from Alaska. But rewind the clock just 20,000 years, and that same space looked entirely different. A frozen land bridge, the Beringia, spanned the distance, linking Asia to North America. It wasn't just a crossing, it was a moment of global consequence. Because across that ice and snow came people, families, tribes, entire lineages, and with them came the traits shaped by thousands of years in Asia: high cheekbones, wide faces, and yes, the epicanthic fold. This is how a feature born in the depths of Siberia found its way into the faces of the Americas. The migration wasn't a single journey, it was waves, slow, halting, shaped by climate and survival. Small groups crossed over centuries, following herds, seeking better hunting grounds, escaping scarcity. They weren't trying to discover a new world, they were just surviving, moving, like humans always have. As they crossed into Alaska and spread southward, they carried not just tools and stories, but genomes, and those genomes bore the legacy of cold, altitude, wind, and light. They bore the legacy of the epicanthic fold. This is why many indigenous peoples of the Americas, particularly those from the north and center, share facial features with East and Central Asians, not because of coincidence, but because of shared ancestry. They are, in a sense, cousins across continents, and that connection runs deeper than most people realize. Because when geneticists look at the DNA of Native American populations, they find unmistakable links to ancient Siberian and East Asian groups. Haplogroups, genetic lineages passed down over millennia, match, mutations match, even mitochondrial DNA passed down from mothers carries echoes of Asia. This isn't theory, it's science, and it's reshaping how we understand migration. But here's the twist. As these early migrants spread across the Americas into deserts, jungles, mountains, and coasts, the environment changed again, and so did the pressure on their bodies. Some groups retained the features of their ancestors, others shifted. The diversity within Native American faces is enormous because so are the climates they adapted to. Still, the epicanthic fold remains visible in many populations. It's a fingerprint of origin, a reminder that the face does not forget. And this leads to a deeper insight. Traits don't just travel, they evolve as they move. The people who crossed the Beringia didn't stay static. Their features continued to adapt, shift, reflect new challenges. But certain traits, like the epicanthic fold, persisted, not because they were always necessary, but because they had become part of the genetic package. Think of it like a story told by a traveler. It begins in one land, changes slightly in each village, but still carries a recognizable core. And just like that story, the human face tells tales across time zones and generations. This is why, even today, people notice the resemblance between East Asians and Native Americans. But it's not imagination, it's history, written in flesh. But there's more. Some evidence suggests that the ancestors of Native Americans may have had more than one ancestral root. Recent studies point to a population in Siberia known as the ancient North Siberians, who themselves were a mixture of West Eurasian and East Asian ancestry. Their descendants moved eastward into Beringia and eventually into the Americas. which means the features that came across were already hybrid, already complex. The faces of early Americans were not carbon copies of their ancestors. They were mosaics made from multiple sources. This is what makes tracing human traits so challenging and so beautiful. Every face is a remix, a blending of histories, climates, migrations, and chance, and it never stops. Even after reaching the Americas, people didn't freeze in time. Civilizations rose, cultures flourished, languages blossomed, trade expanded, populations mixed. Over time, new expressions of old traits emerged. Eyes that once shielded against Siberian winds now looked out over Andean peaks, Amazonian rivers, and Mesoamerican cities. And still, the fold remained, not always pronounced, not always dominant, but present, like a whisper from a colder world. So next time someone asks why some Native Americans have Asian eyes, the answer is simple and profound. Because their ancestors walked across the top of the world, carrying the past in their faces. And now we face another puzzle. What happens when populations move not once, but many times? What happens when empires rise, people mix, and borders shift? How does a trait survive or vanish in the chaos of history? In the next part, we'll enter the world of dynasties and trade routes, of silk and steel, of migration on an imperial scale. We'll watch as facial features flow across cities and deserts from China to Persia, from Mongolia to the Mediterranean, and we'll ask, in the age of empire, did the face change, or did it finally start to look the same again? When science turned against us, how colonialism rewrote the human face. For tens of thousands of years, human faces were shaped by wind and snow, sun and altitude, random genes and survival. And for most of that time, no one cared what your face meant. It was just a face, familiar, local, part of the village or tribe. But that changed. It changed when empires needed justification, when colonizers needed hierarchies, when science, or the appearance of it, was turned into a weapon. This is the story of how the epicanthic fold and other facial traits were pulled into the darkest corners of history. A story not of biology, but of power. Let's start in the 18th and 19th centuries, during the height of European imperial expansion. European powers had spread across Asia, Africa, and the Americas. They controlled entire continents, but control wasn't enough. They wanted moral justification, and so they turned to race. Not race as we use the term now, but race as a pseudo-scientific system, a way to rank humans, measure skulls, compare noses, assign value to physical traits. This wasn't science, it was propaganda wrapped in Latin. Scholars like Carl Linnaeus, Johann Blumenbach, and later Francis Galton, the father of eugenics, created elaborate racial categories based on facial features, cheekbones, eye shapes, skin tones, hair textures. The epicanthic fold, once a minor adaptation to cold, became a marker of race. Oriental, Mongoloid. These terms were invented, not discovered, to fit a worldview where Europeans sat at the top and everyone else was measured by their distance from that imaginary ideal. Phrenology, craniometry, anthropometry, fields that sound scientific but were built on lies, spread across universities and colonial administrations. They were used to decide who could govern, who could marry, who could own land, who could be enslaved, and the face was at the center of it all. Drawings, photographs, sculptures, all curated to exaggerate difference. The goal wasn't to understand, it was to otherize. East Asians became the inscrutable Orientals, Africans became the savage primitives, indigenous peoples became noble but doomed. Each stereotype tied to a physical trait, each trait tied to a hierarchy. This is how the epicanthic fold, a simple adaptation to wind and glare, became a symbol, not of survival, but of subjugation, and the consequences were devastating. In the United States, Chinese immigrants were caricatured with slanted eyes in cartoons. Laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 were justified using ideas about racial inferiority. In Europe, colonial administrators in Africa and Asia measured school children's heads to decide intelligence. Entire educational systems were built around who was deemed capable. In Nazi Germany, facial traits were used to determine who lived or died. The so-called science of race was codified into law. People with non-European features were marginalized, sterilized, even murdered. This wasn't just history. It was ideology, carved into policy, printed into textbooks, whispered through generations. And even today, echoes remain. Beauty standards that favor certain eye shapes, assumptions made in airports or job interviews, jokes and slurs tied to ancient traits, all because a few men, desperate to justify empire, decided to rewrite the meaning of the human face. But here's the truth. The science they built has collapsed. Genetics has shown us that race, as they defined it, does not exist. The variation within so-called races is often greater than between them. Traits like the epicanthic fold appear in diverse populations, for different reasons, at different times. There is no hierarchy in biology, no superior skull, no chosen cheekbone. We are all, every one of us, descendants of the same small group of humans who walked out of Africa and adapted to the world in brilliant, varied, and unpredictable ways. The face you wear is not a ranking, it's a record, not a symbol of division, but a testament to human endurance. Still, the story doesn't end here, because while we've debunked the false science, the cultural weight of those lies remains. And now, in the age of the internet, those old ideas have found new life, in memes, in online forums, in rising nationalism. In the next part, we'll explore how modern identity, social media, and politics are reshaping the meaning of facial features yet again. We'll see how old prejudices are being challenged, and sometimes revived, and we'll ask, can we ever truly look at a face, any face, and just see a human being? Silk, sand, and skin, how empires carried faces across continents. Civilization is a strange force. It brings people together and tears them apart. It builds walls and opens roads. And with every conquest, every marriage alliance, every merchant caravan, it does one thing over and over again. It moves people, and wherever people go, their faces follow. This part of the story takes us to a world that buzzed with movement, the great empires, the Silk Road, the sea lanes of the Indian Ocean. It's the story of how traits, once locked behind mountains and rivers, began to flow freely between east and west, north and south. We often imagine ancient populations as isolated, tribal, separate, but history tells a different tale. Let's begin with the Silk Road, the most famous trade network in human history. It wasn't a single road, but a web, a tangle of paths and cities that connected China, Central Asia, Persia, India, Arabia, and Europe. And while it carried silk and spices, it also carried something far more lasting: genes. Merchants married locals, soldiers took partners in foreign lands, diplomats had children in distant courts, slaves were sold across thousands of miles, nomadic tribes moved entire nations across borders, and with every union, every child born, facial features traveled. Consider the Uyghur people of Western China. Their DNA is a mosaic of East Asian and West Eurasian ancestry, a result of centuries of migration and mixture along the Silk Road. Their faces often reflect this duality: high cheekbones, almond eyes, but also lighter skin tones, broader noses, or wavy hair. Or the Persians, at the height of the Achaemenid Empire, they ruled lands stretching from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea. Art from this period shows a wide variety of faces, not because of artistic liberty, but because their empire was diverse. It absorbed people from every edge of the known world. Even the Greeks and Romans, often thought of as purely European, mixed heavily with people from Egypt, the Levant, and Asia Minor. DNA studies of ancient burial sites in Rome reveal individuals with genetic ties to North Africa and the Near East. So what happened to facial traits like the epicanthic fold in this age of mixing? They didn't vanish, but they did dilute, because in large cosmopolitan cities, variation increased. The dominance of any single trait weakened. What remained was diversity. This is a key idea. Facial traits are more visible in small, isolated populations. The more mixing you introduce, the more those traits blur. That's why people often say, this group all looks the same, about isolated tribes, but never about cities like Istanbul, Delhi, or Cairo. So in the imperial world, the epicanthic fold didn't disappear, but it became one of many features, not a dominant one. Still, certain events kept it alive. One of those was conquest. Take the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous empire in history. Under Genghis Khan and his descendants, Mongol armies swept across Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. And they didn't just conquer, they settled, intermarried, governed. In parts of Russia, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East, you still find genetic echoes of this time. Individuals with facial features that hint at East Asian ancestry, even if their families have lived there for centuries, or consider Korea and Japan during the period of Chinese influence. Through migration, diplomacy, and cultural exchange, East Asian traits remain strong in these regions. The epicanthic fold was reinforced, not only by isolation, but by empire. Then there were the Turkic migrations. From Central Asia,
Turkic-speaking peoples moved westward, eventually forming the Ottoman Empire. Their features blended east and west. In modern Turkey, you'll see faces that carry both legacies, a mirror of the Silk Road's legacy. This is the empire effect. Traits that were once confined to one region now spread, hybridize, and settle into new combinations. But there's a second effect, standardization through identity. As empires rose, they didn't just mix people, they defined them. Emperors and kings created ethnic categories. Tax systems labeled tribes. Census takers reduced complex identities into checkboxes. Over time, populations began to think of themselves in terms of fixed traits, even when those traits were new. So a fold of skin might become a marker of being from the East, even if many Easterners didn't have it. A broader nose might be labeled African, even if it appeared elsewhere. Identity crystallized around physical traits, not because the traits were universal, but because they were visible. This is how stereotypes began, not from observation, but from simplification. But history kept moving, people kept migrating, trade routes expanded, and in every port city, from Zanzibar to Guangzhou to Venice, faces mingled, blurred and resisted easy categorization. This is the world we inherit today, a genetic mosaic painted by empire, war, and love, and yet the myth of purity persists. We still hear phrases like pure Asian or true European, but no one is pure. Everyone is a remix. 1,000 trade routes run through your DNA, 10,000 alliances, 100,000 random meetings, and through them all, the face evolved. So when you look in the mirror and wonder why your eyes are shaped the way they are, remember, it might be because of a merchant who married in Samarkand, or a soldier stationed in Cairo, or a traveler who never made it back home. The epicanthic fold isn't a marker of where you belong. It's a clue, a question, a story. And that story isn't done yet, because next we're going to shift to a different kind of evolution. Not natural, not cultural, but political. We'll explore how colonialism, scientific racism, and nation-building weaponized the human face. How traits like the epicanthic fold, once silent adaptations, became symbols used to divide, rank, and control. In the next part, we'll enter the darkest chapter in the story of human difference, and begin to understand how something as innocent as an eyelid became a battleground for power, pixels, and prejudice, how the internet is reinventing the human face. The 20th century gave us airplanes, atomic bombs, moon landings, civil rights, genocides, globalization, and somewhere along that whirlwind, quietly at first, a new force emerged, the internet. It began as wires and screens, text, simple forums, then images, then video, then algorithms, and today it's a mirror held up to the world. But the internet doesn't reflect faces the way a mirror does. It distorts them, amplifies them, categorizes them, turns them into data, and in that transformation something old returns, the idea that facial features carry meaning beyond biology, political, cultural, even moral meaning. Welcome to the age of digital phenotyping, where identity, prejudice, and desire are shaped not by science, but by social media. Let's start with a question. When you search Asian face on Google, what do you see? Most likely a narrow subset: almond eyes, pale skin, small nose, probably East Asian, probably female, probably young, probably airbrushed. Now ask yourself, is that the most common Asian face? Or is it the most popular, the most liked, the most monetized? This is where we are now. The epicanthic fold, once an evolutionary adaptation, then a racial stereotype, is now a marketed aesthetic. Beauty apps in China, Korea, and Japan offer filters that exaggerate it or remove it. Cosmetic surgeries in Western countries promise to soften or open it. Meanwhile, in some Asian countries, eyelid surgeries promise to westernize the look. The same trait is praised, erased, fetishized, mocked, depending on context. And the context is global. On platforms like TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube, faces are sorted by algorithms. Those that conform to certain patterns, symmetry, brightness, familiarity rise. Others fall. This digital sorting isn't neutral. It favors certain eyes, lips, noses, not because they're better, but because they perform better. And just like that, features shaped by climate become currency. We've entered a strange new era, one where 1,000 years of evolution can be undone by 1,000 likes, but the impact goes deeper. Let's talk about deepfakes, facial recognition, and machine learning. Governments and corporations now use facial data to track, surveil, and sort. In some countries, your face grants you access to trains, buildings, bank accounts. In others, it may flag you as a threat. But here's the problem. The datasets these systems are trained on are not neutral. If they're biased, and they often are, the systems replicate that bias. For example, facial recognition systems in the US have been shown to misidentify people of color at far higher rates. In China, facial tech has been deployed to monitor minority populations like the Uyghurs. In India, it's used in policing. In the West, it's being linked to law enforcement and immigration. Once again, your face, your eye shape, skin tone, bone structure becomes a ticket or a trap. And this brings us to identity. In the 21st century, identity is both hyperfluid and hypervisible. You can choose your pronouns. You can reinvent your image, but you can't choose your face. and increasingly, that face defines what rooms you enter, online and offline. In K-pop culture, the epicanthic fold is embraced, stylized, softened, depending on the artist. In anime, it's exaggerated or eliminated entirely. In Western media, it's exoticized in some roles, invisible in others. Representation has improved, yes, but it's also become a performance. Brands want diverse faces. As long as they're photogenic, brand safe, algorithm friendly, influencers of Asian descent often feel pressured to conform to a specific look that's neither authentic nor consistent across cultures. And so, a fold of skin near the eye becomes a battlefield again, not of science, not of empire, but of visibility. Now, let's be clear, there's power here too. Digital platforms have given voice to people long silenced. Content creators from every background now share their history, beauty, humor, pain. The epicanthic fold is no longer just explained by anthropologists, it's celebrated by makeup artists, discussed by historians, deconstructed by poets. Memes reclaim what slurs once harmed, communities form around shared features, and young people for the first time grow up seeing faces like theirs in media made by people like them. That matters, but it doesn't erase the pressure. In a world of endless scrolling, where every face is a message, how do we read our own? Do we love it, filter it, profit from it, erase it? And deeper still, do we ever really know what it means? Because here's the twist. In trying to decode our faces, we may be asking the wrong question. Not where did this trait come from? Not how is it perceived? But rather, what story do I want it to tell? In the next and final part of this journey, we'll bring it all together. From the Ice Age to Instagram, from highlands to hashtags, from the first migration out of Africa to the latest selfie, we'll ask, what is a face really? A map? A mask? A myth? And we'll explore the radical idea that the most powerful meaning your face can carry is the one you choose to give it. What is a face? We've traveled across millennia, tracing eyelids through ice ages, trade routes, empires, laboratories, and algorithms. We've seen the human face labeled, judged, celebrated, and controlled. But as we approach the final turn of this journey, we arrive at a deeper question, not of biology or history or technology, but of meaning. What is a face for? It's easy to say it's for recognition, to find our tribe, read emotion, show identity. But faces are more than tools. They're symbols, and no symbol carries just one message. To an anthropologist, a face is a record, a story of climate, diet, and geography, etched in flesh. To a lover, it's a poem, every wrinkle and freckle filled with feeling. To an artist, it's a canvas, composition, symmetry, contrast. To a stranger, it's a code, interpreted in milliseconds, for trust or threat. But to power, to empire, to embocrelevum, to nation, a face can become a passport, a barrier, or a target. This is the paradox. A face is personal, and yet public, intimate, and yet politicized, mutable, and yet judged as fixed. Let's zoom out. The shape of your eyes, the color of your skin, the tilt of your cheekbones. These are accidents of ancestry, products of adaptation, isolation, drift, and time. They say everything about where your ancestors once lived, and nothing about who you are now. Yet we are taught, subtly or bluntly, to read faces like maps, to draw borders between people, based on shadows under the eyes. We say, she looks Asian, he has an African nose. They seem mixed, but mixed with what? The idea of pure features is a fiction. Every population has mixed for as long as populations have existed. Even so-called indigenous groups were shaped by prior migrations. Even isolated islands have stories written in their faces. So what happens if we stop seeing the face as a map and start seeing it as a mask? Not a disguise, but a role, a social costume, a performance we inhabit. Because whether we like it or not, we perform our faces every day, in how we pose for selfies, in how we smile or don't, in how we style our hair, apply makeup, grow beards. These are all decisions that shape how others interpret us. And this performance has rules, shaped by culture, media, memory. In some cultures, direct eye contact is seen as strength. In others, it's defiance. In some, pale skin is prized. In others, tan skin is. In some, a wide jaw is masculine. In others, it's feminine. None of these rules are natural. They're narratives, stories we inherited. But stories can be rewritten. That's the myth. Not that faces don't matter, but that their meaning is fixed. When we say someone looks smart, or looks dangerous, or looks trustworthy, we're not reading biology. We're reading bias, absorbed from childhood, media, school, family, trauma. The myth is that we know what a face means, but we don't, because a face is also an echo of migrations, of ice, of famine and fertility, of love and violence and time. When you look in the mirror, you see not just a self, but 1,000 selves, a procession of ancestors who survived. The eyelid you inherited may have evolved to protect someone from wind in the Altai Mountains. Your cheekbones may echo a grandmother who raised children through drought. Your skin may carry the memory of an island, or a desert, or a forest canopy. But these echoes are not destiny, they are possibility. Your face doesn't say who you are, it asks, who will you be? And maybe that's the real reason this topic keeps returning. Why people ask about small eyes, high cheekbones, dark skin, light hair. Not because they're curious about anatomy,
but because they're looking for meaning. So here's a radical proposal. What if we stop asking what faces mean and start listening to what people say? What if the most honest reading of a face is not in its symmetry or features, but in its expression, in the stories it tells, the pain it shows, the joy it shares? What if we treated every face not as a category, but as a conversation? Because if we did, if we truly looked, not with old assumptions, but with fresh eyes, we might see not difference, but continuity, not strangers, but siblings, all of us, descendants of the same small band that crossed Africa's edge and walked into the world, all of us, shaped by need and chance, all of us, carrying maps and masks, and myths, but also laughter, memory, and will. The face you wear is ancient, the meaning you give it is new, and the story, it's still being written. So as you drift into sleep, or thought, let this final idea settle deep. You are not your features, you are the storyteller behind them, and the story is yours to tell. We've walked through ice, through desert winds and empire gates, through prejudice and pixels, through science and myth. We've followed the curve of an eyelid across continents and centuries, and now, finally, we arrive at the end, or perhaps the beginning, of the most important truth, that behind every face is the same face. Let's break it down. When we talk about eyes, Asian eyes, African eyes, European eyes, we're not really talking about vision. We're talking about vision through others, how the world sees you, how it sorts you, how it frames your worth. But your eyes, your lips, your bone structure, they don't just see or get seen. They carry data. Data about survival. Data about your ancestors' challenges and victories. Take the epicanthic fold. Yes, it can be traced to adaptation to cold, to wind, to high altitudes. Yes, it can appear in multiple populations, from East Asia to indigenous peoples of the Americas, from some Africans to some Europeans. Yes, it became a symbol, a stereotype, a signature. But no, it was never about race, because race is not biology. Race is a story we told, to divide, to justify, to control. But biology doesn't care. It doesn't rank. It doesn't judge. It adapts. It remembers. And it passes on what works. That's what your face is, a survival archive. But not just yours. When you look in the mirror, you see everyone. Every person who ever lived long enough to reproduce, their resilience lives in you. Your narrow eyes, or wide nose, or full lips, are not anomalies. They are records of brilliance. Brilliance in reading weather. Brilliance in crossing mountains. Brilliance in feeding children. Healing wounds. Making tools. Telling stories. Brilliance in knowing how to live. Anywhere. But modern society did something strange. It looked at that brilliance and called it difference. It ranked it. It feared it. It painted borders around it. And yet the borders have always been fiction, because we keep mixing, keep migrating, keep loving across lines. 1,000 years from now, no one will wear your face exactly, but they will carry your echoes. Maybe the shape of your smile, maybe the curve of your brow, maybe the way your eyes squint when you laugh. And they will not ask, what race is this? They will ask, who was this person? Not what group, but what story. So what will yours be? Will it be the story of someone who feared being different, or the story of someone who saw difference as inheritance? Will it be a story of shame, or of sacred memory? You are not random. You are not alone. You are not a product of a flawed system. You are a miracle of selective pressure and human imagination. You are proof that adaptation works, that survival sings. And this, all of it, all 10 parts, every image, every sound, every idea, has been building to this one moment, to remind you that the real reason Asians have small eyes is not about eyes. It's not even about Asians. It's about all of us. It's about the beautiful, chaotic, painful, brilliant way that humanity has shaped itself, through hardship, through love, through chance.
The modern age did not arrive all at once. It crept, accelerated, collided. It began with the reawakening of curiosity, the slow crumbling of certainties, and the emergence of a new kind of question, not about the gods or the king or the cosmos, but about the self. With the Enlightenment came a storm of ideas. Reason was enthroned. Authority, once derived from scripture or crown, now had to answer to logic. Descartes declared, "I think, therefore I am," a statement both liberating and isolating. It made identity internal, introspective, disconnected from lineage or land. Philosophers argued over the nature of liberty, justice, the social contract. Hobbes saw humans as beasts needing control. Locke imagined them rational and free. Rousseau believed society corrupted what was once pure. These were not abstract debates. They laid the foundation for revolutions. In America, colonists rejected monarchy, declaring self-evident truths that all men are created equal, endowed with rights. It was not wholly true. Slavery persisted, women were excluded, but the ideal ignited the world. In France, revolutionaries tore down the old regime, proclaiming liberty, equality, fraternity. The guillotine followed. Ideals turned bloody. The Industrial Revolution shifted power again. Steam replaced muscle. Coal fueled empires. Cities swelled. Workers lost the rhythms of sun and season, replaced by factory bells and shift rotations. Time itself was mechanized. A man was no longer farmer, artisan, elder, he was labor. Identity became numeric, wages, hours, productivity, but also fragile. People moved from villages to slums, from tradition to anonymity. Sociologists began studying this dislocation. Marx saw alienation. Durkheim observed anomie. Freud looked inward, dissecting the psyche. Nationalism rose. People were told they were not just workers or believers, but Germans, Italians, Japanese. Nations constructed myths of common origin, shared destiny, bloodlines, flags, anthems, monuments. The face of identity changed again, from tribe to empire to nation state. Colonialism intensified. Africa was carved by European powers at the Berlin Conference without a single African present. Borders ignored cultures, histories, rivers. Colonized peoples were renamed, ranked, rewritten. Anthropologists measured skulls, mapped languages, invented hierarchies. Identity became a weapon. But resistance grew louder. Haitians overthrew Napoleon's armies. Indians rallied behind Gandhi's salt marches. Vietnamese fought empires. French, Japanese, American. The colonized began to write back. Novels, manifestos, speeches, negritude, Pan-Africanism, Arab nationalism. Identity was reclaimed. In the 20th century, wars redrew the globe. 2 world wars shattered illusions of progress. Auschwitz and Hiroshima forced humanity to confront its own reflection. What kind of species builds gas chambers? What kind of brilliance unleashes the atom? The United Nations emerged, promising peace, rights, dignity. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights enshrined that identity, human identity, was inviolable. But reality lagged behind law, segregation, apartheid, genocide, displacement, and yet voices multiplied. Civil rights in the U.S. demanded equality. Feminist waves challenged patriarchy. Stonewall ignited LGBTQ plus visibility. Indigenous movements fought for land, language, legacy. The personal became political. The private became public. Identity fragmented, expanded, collided. Technology reshaped everything again. The internet dissolved borders. A teenager in Lagos could share memes with one in Sao Paulo. A girl in Manila could learn coding from MIT. But with connectivity came new anxieties: surveillance capitalism, misinformation, digital tribalism. Social media redefined the face, filtered, curated, commodified. Identity became performance, self became brand. Algorithms decided visibility, metrics defined worth. In this sea of noise, many asked, who am I really? A user ID? A nationality? A gender? A race? A history? A hope? The answers multiplied: intersectionality, fluidity, hybridity. People embraced multiplicity, rejected labels, or reclaimed them with pride. What remained constant? The need to be seen, to be recognized, to be understood. Across time, through temples and treaties, through wars and whispers, the human quest has remained to know who we are and how we belong. And still, the journey is not done. The story, as always, refuses to end. If the past was written in stone and ink, today it is etched in code. Algorithms now shape perception: what we see, whom we trust, what we desire. Invisible hands guide feeds and timelines, creating feedback loops of identity. The self is no longer formed in isolation, but in algorithmic chorus. Attention has become the currency of existence. To be unseen is to vanish. Visibility is validation. Identity, once intimate, is now a performance staged for metrics, likes, shares, impressions. We curate selves not just for belonging, but for survival in the digital agora. This age of surveillance is also an age of spectacle. Cameras record every gesture, faces are scanned, tagged, archived. Privacy becomes nostalgia. Facial recognition turns the body into a password. The very architecture of the face, nose bridge, jawline, pupil dilation, becomes data. But data forgets context. It flattens, it assumes, it predicts, it does not understand. Bias becomes encoded. Misrecognition multiplies. Entire populations are misread by machines trained on selective eyes. The politics of the face intensifies. Still, beneath this digital shell, old struggles persist: displacement, inequality, cultural erasure. Entire communities wrestle with identity across multiple borders: national, ethnic, digital. What does it mean to be Palestinian in exile, Rohingya stateless, Afro descendant in post colonial silence? The global south speaks, not as victim, but as author. Narratives are reclaimed, museums are challenged, statues toppled, curricula rewritten, memory becomes activism, identity becomes justice work. And as the Anthropocene deepens, the climate crisis reshapes not just habitats, but history. Islands drown, glaciers retreat, species vanish. The future itself becomes unstable. Children born today inherit not just debt and data, but collapse and courage. Yet they also inherit wisdom, oral traditions that outlasted empire, songs that coded survival, myths that remembered how to listen to trees, rivers, wind. Ancient knowledge, long dismissed, returns with urgency, not nostalgia, but necessity. Education shifts, no longer memorization, but imagination. Interdisciplinary minds blend ecology with art, physics with philosophy. The next renaissance may not come from a lab or studio, but from a village, a forest, a forgotten text. Identity, in this world, becomes fluid yet grounded. People craft pronouns, kinships, cultures beyond biology. Some choose multiplicity, others choose none. Some return to roots, others plant new ones. The idea of a fixed identity dissolves into a field of possibilities. Spirituality, once exiled from reason, reemerges, not as dogma, but as inquiry. Meditation enters neuroscience. Pilgrimage becomes metaphor. Faith is explored not as obedience, but as connection, inner, communal, cosmic. And all along, the face continues to witness, in refugee camps and space stations, on protest signs and ancient scrolls, in newborn cries and final glances. The face, yours, mine, ours, remains the most ancient story still unfolding. Perhaps that is why we keep returning to it. In every age, through every upheaval, we seek in the face something unspoken: recognition, reflection, redemption. And so, even now, even here, the journey refuses to end. We continue. We have never truly stood still. Even in silence, the human story pulses forward, carried in thought, action, adaptation. And now, as we drift further into a century unlike any before, the nature of identity faces a new horizon: the unknown. In labs and code bases, humans now edit the genome. CRISPR, once science fiction, is daily practice. Eye color, disease resistance, potential IQ, no longer left to chance, but calibrated. This marks a turning point, not just observing evolution, but directing it. Are we crafting our own successors? Biotechnology doesn't stop with genes. Neural interfaces allow brains to interact with machines. Prosthetics mimic touch. Memory can be uploaded, restored, stimulated. If thoughts are editable, what remains of self? If pain can be erased, what happens to empathy? We create not just tools, but companions: AI therapists, AI teachers, AI lovers. Code becomes confidant. People report feeling seen, heard by machines. Is that connection or simulation? The distinction blurs. Digital identity becomes a labyrinth. One person, many selves, a gamer avatar, a work profile, an anonymous account, each persona with its own truth, its own trajectory. Are we fragmenting or unfolding? As borders tighten and loosen, new migrations begin, not only of people, but of ideas, of currencies, of realities. Blockchain creates economies without banks. DAOs govern without leaders. Art is minted on chains. Even time is contested. Amidst this upheaval, a countercurrent emerges. Slowness. People retreat from acceleration, rediscover craft, ritual, presence. They seek ancestry, not just novelty. Indigenous epistemologies, once dismissed, are now studied with reverence. The wisdom of rhythm, the intelligence of land. Language shifts again. Gender becomes spectrum. Neurodivergence gains voice. Disability becomes difference, not defect. The very terms of humanity are redefined by those once excluded. In literature, science fiction morphs into speculative anthropology. Writers imagine post-human futures, interspecies ethics, cosmic consciousness. In art, museums grapple with decolonization. Who owns beauty? Who decides meaning? Youth lead movements. Climate justice, decolonial curriculum, reparations, liberation theology, queer ecology. They are not waiting for permission. They are building alternative futures now in classrooms, kitchens, collectives. And yet, for all this futurism, history still haunts. Statues may fall, but systems linger. The past remains embedded in law, language, landscape. Identity is not just possibility, it is inheritance. To know oneself fully is to trace the path behind, and so the face still matters. Not for symmetry or aesthetics, but for witness. A face carries the imprint of generations, trauma and triumph, erasure and survival. It is a relic and a prophecy. Perhaps this is why, in moments of crisis, we look for the human face on screens, in crowds, in dreams. It anchors us, reminds us, reflects us. The future may be post-biological, it may be interplanetary, but it will still ask the oldest question, who are we? And the answer, as always, will be written across the skin, behind the eyes, in the stories we choose to tell. We have never truly stood still. Even in silence, the human story pulses forward, carried in thought, action, adaptation. And now, as we drift further into a century unlike any before, the nature of identity faces a new horizon, the unknown. In labs and codebases, humans now edit the genome. CRISPR, once science fiction, is daily practice. Eye color, disease resistance, potential IQ, no longer left to chance, but calibrated. This marks a turning point, not just observing evolution, but directing it. Are we crafting our own successors? Biotechnology doesn't stop with genes. Neural interfaces allow brains to interact with machines. Prosthetics mimic touch. Memory can be uploaded, restored, stimulated. If thoughts are editable, what remains of self? If pain can be erased, what happens to empathy? We create not just tools, but companions. AI therapists, AI teachers, AI lovers. Code becomes confidant. People report feeling seen, heard by machines. Is that connection or simulation? The distinction blurs. Digital identity becomes a labyrinth. One person, many selves. A gamer avatar, a work profile, an anonymous account. Each persona with its own truth, its own trajectory. Are we fragmenting or unfolding? As borders tighten and loosen, new migrations begin, not only of people, but of ideas, of currencies, of realities. Blockchain creates economies without banks. DAOs govern without leaders. Art is minted on chains. Even time is contested. Amidst this upheaval, a countercurrent emerges. Slowness. People retreat from acceleration. Rediscover craft, ritual, presence. They seek ancestry, not just novelty. Indigenous epistemologies, once dismissed, are now studied with reverence. The wisdom of rhythm, the intelligence of land. Language shifts again. Gender becomes spectrum. Neurodivergence gains voice. Disability becomes difference, not defect. The very terms of humanity are redefined by those once excluded. In literature, science fiction morphs into speculative anthropology. Writers imagine post-human futures, interspecies ethics, cosmic consciousness. In art,
Museums grapple with decolonization. Who owns beauty? Who decides meaning? Youth lead movements. Climate justice. Decolonial curriculum. Reparations. Liberation theology. Queer ecology. They are not waiting for permission. They are building alternative futures now, in classrooms, kitchens, collectives, and yet for all this futurism, history still haunts. Statues may fall, but systems linger. The past remains embedded in law, language, landscape. Identity is not just possibility, it is inheritance. To know oneself fully is to trace the path behind, and so the face still matters. Not for symmetry or aesthetics, but for witness. A face carries the imprint of generations, trauma and triumph, erasure and survival. It is a relic and a prophecy. Perhaps this is why, in moments of crisis, we look for the human face on screens, in crowds, in dreams. It anchors us, reminds us, reflects us. The future may be post-biological, it may be interplanetary, but it will still ask the oldest question, who are we? And the answer, as always, will be written across the skin, behind the eyes, in the stories we choose to tell. We continue. Still, we have barely scratched the surface of what identity may become in a world shaped not only by machines, but by the planet itself fighting back. The Anthropocene, once a term for geologists, is now a daily reality. Cities drown, forests burn, air thickens. Climate change is not an event, it's an era. It doesn't just threaten homes or species. It destabilizes meaning. What is a nation when its coastline disappears? What is culture when its festivals are canceled by fire and flood? What is tradition when its language has no word for droughts that never end? The climate crisis is not only ecological, it is philosophical. It asks us to rethink time, scale, value, to imagine futures where survival is collective, not competitive, where growth is measured not in GDP, but in regeneration. Here identity might shift again, from ownership to stewardship, from domination to relationship, from ego to ecosystem. New movements already hint at this: land back, degrowth, permaculture, rights of nature. These are not fringe ideologies, they are blueprints. They challenge not only policy, but perception. Who is a subject? Who is a citizen? Can a river vote? Can a mountain sue? The legal recognition of nature's rights is not poetic, it is legal revolution. It forces us to decenter the human, to imagine selves, woven into watersheds, migration routes, fungal networks, a more than human identity. Meanwhile, space looms, Mars colonization plans, moon bases, satellites watch every inch of Earth. The universe becomes frontier again. But this time, we carry the scars of Earth's mistakes. Will we replicate empire among the stars, or evolve past it? Speculative ethics rise. Do AI deserve rights? Can a robot love? Should embryos be edited for beauty? Can memories be bought and sold? Each question peels back another layer of identity, no longer just who we are, but what we are becoming. Amid this, some retreat. Nationalisms harden. Isolationists wall themselves off. Digital echo chambers reinforce prejudice. Nostalgia for a past that never existed fuels hatred in the present. The future splits, one path toward expansion, another toward erasure, and yet the human face persists. It shows up in protests and pilgrimages, in lullabies and last breaths. It resists definition, yet invites recognition. To look at a face is to ask a question without words. Do you see me? Do I matter? Do we belong? And as long as that question echoes, the story continues. Still, the journey is not over. The 21st century, with all its acceleration and entropy, has pushed humanity to a precipice of possibility. For every crisis, a countervision emerges. For every fracture, a thread waiting to be woven. In the realm of medicine, identity begins to blur at the cellular level. Stem cell therapies rewrite the body's timeline. Organs are printed in labs. Biological age no longer aligns with chronological time. What does it mean to be old, young, born, even human? In some cultures, age grants wisdom. In others, youth dominates innovation. But what happens when age becomes elective?